Welcome back to Journey to Indomitus. I'll be your host, Dana Howell, and today we're going to be exploring a number of different possibilities of bases for use in our 40k armies. So as you might know, I've started getting into Warhammer 40k recently, and I've challenged myself to fully paint 3 armies by the end of the year. The first step for me when planning out any sort of army is the themes and color schemes, which is something I've gradually been working on over the last few weeks. Now that I've figured out my color schemes and I kind of know what direction I want to go in with most of the armies, the next step that I usually take is to figure out what sort of basing scheme I'm going to use for the army. So while we're doing this, I figured I might as well kill 2 Necrons with one 40k analogy and do a video that has been requested for a long time, which is a video on basing rollers or textured rolling pins. These are basically rolling pins like you might use for baking, but instead of being flat, they have textures in them. So when you roll them onto a surface, it will imprint the texture into the surface. A lot of people use these for basing their models, as well as display boards and various other purposes. A lot of the products I'm using today have been purchased from GreenStuffWorld, and this is not a sponsored video. I've bought all this stuff myself. These are just products I really like to use. However, if you want full disclosure, once they saw I was working on this video, they actually contacted me and asked me if I did want free products. So if you're wondering if there's any bias in this video, I don't think there is, but I'm excited to see what free products they send me. I've seen a lot of comments from people on YouTube and various social media platforms saying that they're not getting very good results from their rollers, and they have wondered how I get such crisp results with mine. It's due to a couple factors, a top 10 factors. So let's get right into it, and I will tell you what I think are the most important things when using these tools. So the first is, what clay are you using with your rollers? And for me, I would recommend that the one that you use is also a product from GreenStuffWorld, coincidentally, which is called Brown Stuff. It's not the best name, but it is a brown 2-part epoxy putty that is kind of like green stuff. Unlike a lot of 2-part epoxies, it is not brittle, and when it dries, it is somewhat flexible, which you will see comes up a lot. And it is also a lot less soft than something like Sculpey or a softer clay. It's like a very hard clay, which is perfect for imprinting textures into. When I first got these rollers, I experimented with several different types of clay, and I found that the one that worked best was Brown Stuff. But if you can't find Brown Stuff, I would say probably use Green Stuff. I would advise you not to use Milliput. I found Milliput did not work very well. So if you're thinking of trying for the cheaper option, I would recommend not doing that and getting some quality green stuff or brown stuff. You will thank me in the end. Tip number 2, use some gloves. I use nitrile gloves, but recently it's become a lot harder to find nitrile gloves, so using latex gloves or rubber gloves, anything that's going to cover your fingers and be relatively tight on them, so like no kitchen gloves that are loose. But the nice thing about wearing gloves is it's kind of like lubricates your fingers when you're using the clay, and it also removes any fingerprints that you might have, so it just makes working with the epoxy a lot easier. Tip number 3 is to use baby powder, also known as cornstarch. This is mentioned in GreenStuffWorld's official tutorial that I found on YouTube for this product. So this is not like a huge secret, but it's something I feel like a lot of people don't know about. Whenever I'm working with any sort of epoxy, here's what I do. I get a shallow container that I'm not going to mind throwing out because sometimes the mixture can get kind of gross. I fill it with water, and then I dump in a bunch of baby powder, aka cornstarch. Then you're going to want to mix it around until it's relatively combined, and this mixture is going to really save your life throughout this process. You can cover your gloved hands in it to prevent them from sticking to the clay. You can cover your rollers in it to prevent your rollers just from sticking to the clay. It's just generally going to help a lot in lubricating the whole process. A lot of the results you're going to be getting with these rollers is going to be dependent on your rolling technique. So in this step, I'm going to show you how I do it. First, we are going to take a small amount of epoxy and smooth it out onto the base, covering it up thoroughly. You're going to want to leave a little bit of thickness, not too thick and not too thin, sort of like what you're seeing on the screen right now. Once we get it nice and smooth, we can smooth it out even further by using a plain rolling pin. I've purchased this from GreenStuffWorld because it was only like $8, but you could also just use a dowel or whatever other smooth cylindrical things you might have in your home. Before we do this, we're going to want to dip it into our water and get it nice and wet before using it on our clay to prevent any sort of sticking. Once our roller is nice and wet, we're going to use it to smooth out our base like so. At this point, I like to trim off the excess on the base using my hobby knife, which I'm also dipping into the water mixture to prevent sticking. Once that's done, we are ready to roll. Here I am using my flagstone roller as an example roller, and you can see that I am dipping it into the water to get it nice and wet, placing the roller down firmly with both hands on the roller, and then you might want to also have your elbows on the table, and then you're just going to slowly and firmly, evenly move the roller across the base. This can take a little bit of practice, but you should be able to get it. It's really not too complicated. If you followed all the steps up until now, you should get a beautiful little base that looks somewhat like this, although your texture may vary depending on which texture you're using. Tip number 5, common mistakes and issues. Every once in a while, your roller might get stuck to your base. This is normal and it happens every once in a while. It either means that your layer was too thin and you need to use more epoxy, or it means that your roller was not wet enough, so get it wetter. In either case, you can use your hobby knife and your fingers to just remove all the parts from the base and from the roller and just try again. The other common thing that I find happens when I'm rolling is overspill, which is pretty common. So what I like to do is, rather than using my knife to trim it off immediately, I like to wait for it to dry about 3 to 5 hours, enough so that the clay is dry, but not enough so that it is fully hard. And then you can trim it off using your hobby knife. One of the nice things about brown stuff is it's, like I said before, not brittle. So at this 3 to 5 hour range, it's really easy to cut and trim without ruining the texture of your base. Once your bases have had 24 hours to dry, I typically like to give them a quick spray of black primer, followed by a lighter spray of white primer over top to create some easy contrast. I've done this with all of the bases in this tutorial, except for one, which I have spray painted just in gloss black. After that, we can paint these bases however we like. Here are 2 quick test schemes I made up for my Sisters of Battle army and my Necron army. First, we're going to try and make a cathedral base for the Sisters army. To begin, we'll give the entire base a dry brush in a cream-colored paint and follow up with a heavy brown wash. Then I'm going to add just a bit of interest to some of the tiles by painting them in a dark red color, followed by a few more highlights in our initial cream-colored paint. Then we're going to add a few bits of interest to certain parts of the tiles by using a gray-colored glaze. Once we paint the base in a black color, it's basically done. I'm not going to be listing specific paint colors for any of the paint schemes in this video, but I will do my best to list all the paints that I used in the video description. For our second sample base, we're going to try to create an easy oil slick type base for our Necron army. First, we're going to base coat our base in a gloss black primer. Then, we're going to dry brush on a color change paint. This is one of those metallic paints that changes color depending on what way you look at it. It doesn't really matter which color you use. I'm using, I think it's sort of a green to blue one for the initial dry brush. And then we're going to follow this up with 2 coats of a contrasting color change paint on the other side of the base. In this case, the contrasting color is a pink-purple color change paint. Once that's dry, we're going to paint a second coat of our initial color change paint, the greenish one, on the other side of the base. So the effect we're getting is sort of like 4 different colors, which are all kind of glimmering depending on which way you're looking at the base. Finally, we're going to use our brown wash all over the base to create a grungy, weathered look and to increase the shadows. The final base looks kind of oily and metal, like it might have just rained in this part of the city, and I think it's kind of a cool look. Tip number 6, add some little bits of spice to your bases. So, a common issue with making these sorts of bases is that sometimes your base will look pretty much perfect, but there's an area on the base which didn't quite accept the texture of the roller completely. Often also you might have swerved a little bit when you're rolling, and you might have a base where the pattern is slightly curved. So in these cases, depending on how severe they are, sometimes I will just play it where it lays and let it dry like that, and then afterwards, I will just apply some basing paste on top of those areas. Even if the base is completely perfect, sometimes I will do this anyway, just to add some interest to the base. So you don't always have to get a perfect roll. You can always add a little bit of basing paste after, or if you don't like to use basing paste, you can use PVA glue mixed with some sand. To mix it up even further, I've added a few other little bits of debris and stuff here, and that can be fun as well if you're into that. Once our basing paste is dry and we've primed everything, here's an easy scheme that we can use to make this base look like a nice, dirty, industrial base. We're going to start with a heavy dry brush of silver, followed by an overall black wash. After that, we're going to use a more selective brown wash to add a little bit of variety and dirt. Next, we're going to do an overall dry brush of off-white paint to make everything look a little bit dusty and dirty, followed by a lighter dry brush of our initial silver color on just the metallic parts to bring back some of that metallic sheen. Then we can paint the rim of the base in black, and our industrial looking base is done. That one's pretty easy. Tip number 7, the budget base. For tip number 7, I'm going to show you a technique that I often use to create bases which are a little bit cheaper than doing a full rollout. So if you want to save a little bit of epoxy and get something a little bit different, you can use this technique. First, roll out your base as usual and let it dry for 24 hours. When it's dry, use your fingers and your hobby knife to rip pieces off of the base. You can rip off halves, thirds, quarters, whatever you want. In this case, I'm ripping it into thirds. Then you're going to want to get a few extra bases with nothing on them. In this case, I'm doing 3, like I said. And then we're going to fill up the rest of the base with basing paste or PVA glue mixed with sand. Once that's done, you can add other little bits of debris like rocks or bricks or whatever. And then once everything's dry, you can prime it, base coat it in any color we like. Here we're going to do 3 different examples of different biomes. And we're going to start our first one with an off-white, our second one with a brown-red, and our third one with a gray turquoise color, using about 2 coats of paint per base. Once our base coats are dry, we can add a brown wash to all of them except for our gray base, for which we are going to add a black wash, followed by a more selective brown wash. Then to all 3 bases, we can add an overall off-white dry brush to bring out some of the highlights, followed by a few more pops of color, if we like, to some of the other bases. I'm adding just a little bit of more intense red to the red base, and a little bit of more intense turquoise ink on our gray base. After painting the rims in black, we've got some nice, easy, natural-looking bases that don't use up very much epoxy and are pretty quick and good to make. You could also, I'm not going to do this today, but if you wanted to, you could also add a few tufts of grass or foliage to make these more natural looking. There's a couple reasons to use this method. One, it saves a lot of money on brown stuff because it's not exactly a cheap compound, not as cheap as basing paste anyway. And also, you can use it to create a kind of interesting looking base, which is kind of half textured and half just sand. As a bonus tip, I find that this flagstone roller, using this process, matches almost perfectly with the easy to build Stormcast models' pre-provided bases. Tip number 8, the stack 'em up. If you've been doing this for a while, maybe you get a little bit bored with just a single texture base. Maybe basing paste is not enough for you anymore. Maybe you want something a little bit different. So here's a technique that I use to create some city street style bases with sidewalks or temple bases with staircases, whatever you want to call it. Basically, we're combining two types of base texture and creating a second level. So first, what we're going to do is take our two types of bases that we want the texture of and roll them out and let them dry for 24 hours. In this example, I'm actually using the same roller to do both of these, just different parts of the roller. So one half kind of looks like a sidewalk, one half looks like a futuristic street type of thing. Once everything's dry, you can use your knife to cut the sidewalk off of its base, and then along whatever seam you want, you can cut off the sidewalk part. Then using some super glue, we can glue it on to the part of the road that we want to have a sidewalk. If there's any gaps left over, you can add some super glue or epoxy to smooth them on out. And it's as easy as that. You can have a dual layer base like this, which I think looks kind of interesting, especially for a special model like a hero or something. It's nice to have a little bit of variation from the typical texture of your base. If you find that the seam line looks a little bit not great, then you can always do what I did here and use a little bit of styrene to create a rim on the sidewalk. All I'm doing here is taking a strip of styrene that I had lying around and using some super glue to glue it onto the base, waiting for it to dry, and then using my clippers to clip it off in the appropriate place. Then I'm using my hobby knife to carve in a little bit of additional texture to make it a little bit more interesting. Once we're done and we've primed our base, we can then glaze some turquoise gray onto the stone sidewalk, followed by a base coat on the metal part with a metallic copper paint. Then we're going to give everything an overall brown wash, and once it's dry, we can give everything an overall off-white dry brush. Finally, we can give the metal parts a silver dry brush and add a little bit of mint colored ink onto the copper to give it that oxidized look. And to finish up, we can paint the rim of the base in black and we're done. Tip number 9, internal glow. So there's a number of different bases that you could have an internal glow with. Any sort of ground texture like lava or something that has light beneath it. So here's a couple quick paint tips if you want to create bases with some internal glow techniques. Let's start with a traditional lava base. People always want to know how to make these. So we'll start by priming in black and adding our white overspray as usual, although you could probably just prime this one black if you wanted to. Then we're going to give the base an overall dry brush of our slightly blue-gray color. Once it's dry, we're going to paint all the cracks in the base with a thinned down off-white color to help it sink down into the cracks. It's okay if you overspill a bit into just off the cracks. It will just end up looking more like it's glowing. Once that's dry, we're going to give the cracks and the whole base really an overall orange-yellow wash. This one I'm going to tell you is Casandora Yellow because it's a pretty useful paint and pretty distinct looking, which will give us a nice gradient from bright yellow to slightly orange around the rims of the cracks. Then we're going to use a very, very thin red glaze. See my glazing video for details on how to do glazing to paint the chunks of rock as well as to help the transition between the rock parts and the glowing cracks. After this, we could leave it where it is, or we could add a few more details, including some points of light in the cracks using our off-white paint or just a white paint. And then to finish everything off, I'm using a gloss varnish on the cracks to make everything a little bit shiny and more liquid looking. After that, we're going to paint the base rim in black, and then we're done. A variant on this is something I'm going to call the Tron scheme, because that's what it reminds me of, is the movie Tron, which is a black floor with some glowing lights underneath it. This technique might work especially well with the GreenStuffWorld Necron roller, which I was not able to get because it seems to be sold out everywhere. But if you look it up and you're able to get one, I think this would make for a very cool looking Necron base. Our first few steps are going to be the exact same as the lava base, but after we've painted the cracks, instead of using an orange ink, we're going to be using a light blue ink on one side of the base, and then we're going to slowly blend it with a lime green ink on the other side of the base, creating a sort of gradient. We're going to be wet blending these, but I don't want you to be too intimidated because these are inks, and I think you'll find it's really not too difficult to blend them together. As an optional step, I'm also adding just a little touch of the Casandora Yellow ink to the green side to help it just like pop a little bit more. And after that, I spent a little bit of time blending everything together, but you can spend as much time or as little time on this as you want. It's still going to look pretty good probably either way. Then we can paint the base rim in black, and we're done. As a final tip, I want to encourage you to experiment with all of these techniques, combining and mixing them up and getting new and interesting results. As an example of this, here's a base that I made using multiple techniques from this video, along with some further experimentation to create some water effects. Starting with a dual layer base made by using our stacking technique, we're going to base coat the metal layer in copper metallic paint and base coat the lower level in a dark turquoise paint. We will then paint the cracks in off-white and apply a brown wash to the copper. Using our bright turquoise ink, we are then going to cover up the lower level of the base and hopefully create a shallow water effect. Then we're going to add a silver dry brush to the copper areas and a little bit of stippling in our off-white paint to around the cracks of the water level area. What I'm thinking here is this might look like bubbles or maybe just some variation in the surface of the water area. As a final experiment, we're going to try adding a layer of Vallejo transparent water texture paste on top of the lower level of the base. I've never used this product before, and I'm not sure how it will turn out. As we let it dry, we're going to add a bit of turquoise ink to the copper for an oxide effect. I let the water base dry overnight and applied a second coat of the water texture on top of that and let it dry for another day. And here is the final results. Overall, I'm not sure how happy I am with it. It doesn't look as much like water as it does like ice, but maybe we've learned something here regardless. In any case, I just wanted to show you that it's worth doing things even if you're not sure they're going to succeed, even if it's for a tutorial for YouTube. I think I'm going to continue to experiment more with this water paste, and I'll let you know if I come up with anything really interesting for water bases in the future. Thank you so much for watching, and if you want to see more videos like this, please feel free to let me know down in the comments, or click the like and subscribe button if you want to encourage me to make more videos of this type, because I'm constantly looking at the stats of my YouTube channel, and I will notice. Before we go, I'd like to extend a huge thank you to, oops. I want to be over here when I do that. Before we go, I'd like to extend a huge thank you to our patrons on Patreon. We just passed the $1,500 mark, which is a huge deal for me because I have, for some reason, decided to stop taking on any other sort of work and devote myself entirely to making weekly videos for this YouTube channel. I've just set a new goal on Patreon of $2,000, which is not much, but if we hit that goal, I will be able to pay my rent and my bills, which means I should be able to make weekly videos indefinitely. If you want to see your name up here, get access to bonus content, or if you just love me, you can send me money at patreon.com/Dana Howell. Or you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Dana_Howell. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.